Hello, and today I'm gonna start reacting to something that is kind of this is kind of new for me. I was just thinking, you have all these all these comments on online talking about post-capitalism and things like that, which which I understand and all that. That's not something that I don't understand. I definitely understand that. The But it makes it made me wonder. Okay, so how did we get to this point? And so what is where were we supposed to go? What was the big vision? And and ultimately what where a lot of this stuff leads back to is a guy by the name of Adam Smith. And the book that everybody refers to is The Wealth of Nations, which that's not the official title. That's an abbreviated title. It's the actual title is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. This was written obviously a long time ago, and back when back in the 1700s. And this is really the first kind of takedown of this really dissecting of what an economy is, what a national economy is. How do empires run? How do different types of societies deal with economic questions, and and how effective, according to him, are each of these strategies. This book was written a long time ago, so it's got a lot of questionable things in there in terms of attitudes towards people and all that. And I just want to acknowledge that right off the bat. This is where we had to take it as it was written and in the spirit of the times, you know. And the big thing that they're doing here is that if you are is that you have like European style countries that are advanced, that are at least advanced for the time, and then you have people who are those places that are not advanced, and they're largely described as savage or whatever. And I just it's one of those things that kind of makes this book less accessible these days. And this is actually, I have not actually read this book, right? I haven't. And why not? I mean, this is entirely my wheelhouse. I've read lots of books from this era, but this particular book I've never really had to, because, the concepts of in it are kind of just everybody talks about it, right? Everybody it was referenced so often when I was growing up, and I don't know if it's referenced like that anymore. I'm not even sure if it's seen as valid anymore. But what I want to do is I want to start going through this book and read along with you. And and this book is actually available for free off of Project Gutenberg, because this is definitely in the definitely in the public domain. I'm basically just going to read through each paragraph, and when I find something that really I think needs to be dug down into more, I'll stop and we'll talk about it. And what I'd like is, if you don't agree with the things that I had to say about this, feel free to drop in the comments, because I want to hear from you. This is not just like me. I mean, this video is literally me just reading and talking about it. But a book like this is not just uh, it it needs to be interpreted by more than one person, right? And in the future, I'll probably, if I get all the way through, and when I copied and pasted this into LibreOffice, it was like 573 pages at 12-point font. That's quite a lot. So this is content. This is content, and that's going to be content for a few episodes at least, which is the best kind of content, right? And I hope you'll stick with me through all this low effort content here, because I mean, this may seem low effort, but really what it is this is stuff that's kind of important, and that has a lot to do with what's going on around us. And it's important to understand why choices have been made that have led us to this point, because we can't just take the result and like separate it from where it came from. At least I don't think so. everything requires context because otherwise, it's one thing to say, okay, this is wrong. This has changed everything that we're doing, but why is it that things have gotten the way they are? There's always a reason. So, and like a lot of books, like a lot of books of this nature, it's a structure here. It starts with an introduction, introduction and plan of the work. The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with with all the necessaries and conveniences of life which it annually consumes, and which consists always either in the immediate produce of that labor or in what is purchased with that produce from other nations. So so basically, this is he's saying that labor is the basis for everything. According, therefore, as this produce or what is purchased with it bears a greater or smaller proportion to the number of those who are able to consume it, the nation will be better or worse supplied with all the necessaries and conveniences for which it has occasion. So basically, a greater proportion of the population who are able to consume it, basically that makes it better, that makes it stronger. But this proportion must in every nation be regulated by two different circumstances. First, by the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which its labor is generally applied, and secondly, by the proportion between the number of those who are employed in useful labor and that of those who are not so employed, whatever be the soil, climate, or extent of territory of any particular nation. The abundance or scantiness of its annual supply must, in that particular situation, depend upon those two circumstances. So this and he's not here to make arguments in this part. This is just kind of his observations. So kind of the assumptions that are being laid out here is that there are two things that are important. One is labor for its own sake is not really that productive. It says by the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which this labor is generally applied. So what he's saying is that to be useful, labor really has to have an end goal. It has to be to do a thing. And so just like, digging a hole and then filling it back in endlessly, yeah, that's technically labor, but that's not being productive. Uh, and secondly, by the proportion between the number of those who are employed in useful labor and of those that are not so employed. So basically, the larger and this is something that's important, I think, is useful labor and those who are not so employed. He doesn't make a distinction between people who are not employed and those who are employed doing essentially useless things. He's talking about labor that's actually adding value. Now we think of labor and we think of it today as um, that tends to be a very frontline kind of thing, like people working in factories, people working in lines, because labor movement, of course, is all about labor and about a particular kind of labor, skilled craftsmen, as well as more people involved in various trades. And he doesn't make this, and this distinction is not being made here. For example, the people who allow other people to do work, and by which I don't mean give them permission to, but I mean deal with like the organizing of a business and the logistics and things like that. That's all useful, you know. Find people who find new markets for the stuff being made. That is useful because that is what allows stuff to be that's what allows stuff to be purchased, what allows let me see here, necessaries and conveniences of life to be distributed. um, so basically saying that whatever the soil, climate, or extent of territory of any particular nation, the abundance or scantiness of its annual supply must, in that particular situation, depend upon those two circumstances. In other words, for example, we can look at a place like Russia today, where you have vast resources, vast territory, and a system that is so bound up in corruption that there isn't the whole skill, dexterity, and judgment with which its labor is generally applied. I mean, the people who do the work can be extremely highly technically skilled, and that's often the case in places like Russia. Um, but if it's not, but if the people giving the orders on how to do things are not really in it to like be successful at that particular thing and are just kind of checking boxes, which is what tends to happen, um, then the people then that is not useful labor really. It might be somewhat useful, but maybe only 30% of the put of the potential usefulness is actually there. So it doesn't matter what your resources are. It doesn't matter how many people you have working. If there is no good guidance, if there is no good plan, and if honestly your system is bound up in corruption and everybody's just looking out for themselves rather than keeping their eye on what is good for the organization, what's good for the country, what's good for whatever. And that's what I'm getting out of that. Now, maybe, of course, I'm looking at this from a modern filter, right? I'm looking at this from the filter of I understand of what we see happening in the world, what we've seen happen in the past. So we have a lot of so my perspective on this is going to be different than Adam Smith's throughout this whole thing because he doesn't have all of that information. Next paragraph. The abundance or scantiness of the supply too seems to depend more upon the former of those two circumstances than upon the latter. This is a common way of writing back then. So basically, he's expecting you to remember that skill, dexterity, and judgment by which labor is generally applied would be the former, and the latter is the proportion between the number of those who are employed in useful labor and of those who are not so employed. So basically he's in agreement with me that that is the skillful application of labor that seems to be more important than that proportion of those who are gainfully employed versus those who are not. And we come across our first kind of ouch sentence here. Among the savage nations of hunters and fishers, every individual who is able to work is more or less employed in useful labor, and endeavors to provide as well as he can the necessaries and conveniences of life for himself and such of his family or tribe as are either too old or too young or too infirm to go a hunting and fishing. Such nations, however, are so miserably poor that from mere want they are frequently reduced, or at least think themselves reduced, to the necessity sometimes of directly destroying and sometimes of abandoning their infants, their old people, and those afflicted with lingering diseases, to perish with hunger or to be devoured by wild beasts. And okay, I'm going to stop right there because my background is in anthropology, right? My academic background is in anthropology, and this is a and there is some truth to this. Hunter-gatherer groups, they do tend to practice very strict population control, such as infanticide. That is a thing. When we ask ourselves why would it, but they tend to have a lot less stress than we do overall because they don't work as long, right? They may only work 4 hours a day to actually get what they want. The rest of it is kind of, you know, being able to pick up new skills or whatever. As opposed to, say, an agrarian society where you're working pretty much all day long, sun up to sundown, and it's very difficult. And one of the big questions that that kind of anthropologists asked for quite a while was what why was why were people so willing to make the leap from a seemingly more laid back hunter gatherer kind of approach to an agrarian society where you work hard and you work hard every day, and sometimes it doesn't matter how hard you work because the weather works against you, and you know you have all sorts of deprivation regardless of your own labors. So why would you abandon one and pursue the other if it's so hard. And one of the big answers, at least when I was actively uh, studying this stuff, this notion that this not having to, practice infanticide is kind of a big thing. I haven't really seen, I never saw references to like them abandoning their old people and those afflicted with lingering diseases. That was not something that I ever saw a reference to, but again, Adam Smith is not high information regarding this stuff and had a lot of prejudices of his time. But I mean, there is truth in what he says about. He talks about it being miserably poor, and he's talking about things from the European perspective. Continuing on in that paragraph, among civilized and thriving nations, on the contrary, though a great number of people do not labor at all, many of whom consume the produce of 10 times, frequently of 100 times more labor than the greater part of those who work. Yet the produce of the whole labor of the society is so great that all are often abundantly supplied, and a workman, even of the lowest and poorest order, if he is frugal and industrious, may enjoy a greater share of the necessaries and conveniences of life than it is possible for any savage to acquire. And honestly, a lot of this is just propaganda. I mean, really, it is. This is, him stroking his own ego as a European. Contrary, though a great number of people do not labor at all, many of whom consume the produce of 10 times, frequently of 100 times more labor than the greater part of those who work. So he's talking about wealth disparity there. That the people who that do not labor at all. Um, Now, mind you, these people still have titles, right? They're still getting paid as if they have a job, but they're not doing productive work according to what he says. They don't labor. They're If you took them out of the equation, pretty much nothing would change. Um, and that these people can consume the produce of 10 times or 100 times more than than most of those who work. Um, by saying that despite that, despite these parasites, and I'm going to use that term parasites. He doesn't use it, but I'm going to. These people, they says that even with that, the overall gain and productivity is so great that even the lowest workman, if is frugal and industrious, can enjoy a larger amount of necessaries and conveniences of life than is possible for any savage to acquire. And I am going to have to beg to differ from this because when this was written, the Industrial Revolution was already hitting Europe, right? The the really what powered it was coal power and stuff, and that hit Europe earlier than it did the U.S. Jefferson was very opposed to industrializing the U.S., which held us back, and he had a reason to do that. I'm not going to go into whether he was right to have and to. I have my own views on the Jeffersonian ideal, the Jeffersonian republic kind of thing. Um, but basically, what he's saying is that hunter gatherers live a worse life than the lowest and poorest order of workers, and we know that that is not true at all. That is pure propaganda. Because I mean, if you've read accounts of like tenement housing and the okay, let's look at say Whitechapel in London. About the time that Jack the Ripper uh, being active there, the reason why Jack the Ripper was it came to prominence because there were other people who were doing like just as bad or even worse in other parts of London. but Whitechapel was a hotbed of labor organizing. And this was basically a way um, to show just how horrible and desperate the conditions there were, and and how the people there were just there to be preyed on by predators, and distracting from them taking agency in trying to coordinate strikes, marches through the rich area of London, things like that. And this was a very successful uh, media blitz to shape the narrative and distract how from how the people there found it intolerable how they were being forced to live. And you look at what the books that Marx wrote. The reason why Marx uh, Marx wrote what he did was because, again, conditions were so horrible, and it was not seen as feasible for people to improve their lives. You were defined by the conditions of your birth, and if you were born poor, chances are you would live your whole life poor. You would never have an opportunity to advance, and you'd die at a young age. So I kind of have I kind of have I have a disagreement with him about this. I understand where he's coming from, but the effects of it, even during his time, were starting to be pretty clear that yeah, things could be a lot worse for a developed country, for a developed society versus a hunter gatherer society. If you take out the whole infanticide thing, but on the other hand, if you're living in towns and cities, you're going to have you have diseases coming through, epidemics and pandemics, that you can go to a cemetery, if you have a cemetery that goes back to the early 1800s and before, and you can see the clusters of deaths of children within a single family within like a 2 year span. It could be like 10, 5, 6, 7, 8 kids dead. And that's what, and you don't have that in hunter gatherer society. So again, there's this balance there, right? That this book does not take into consideration. But that's just because of the age that he was writing in, and I would like to think that he would be more rephrase these things. He'd rethink some of these things if he knew what we were, if he knew what we knew today. Okay, next paragraph. The causes of this improvement of the productive powers of labor and the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks and conditions of men in the society make the subject of the first book of this inquiry. So what he's saying is that because this book, The Wealth of Nations, is actually divided up into multiple books. It's, basically each book has its own set of chapters and stuff. So whatever be the actual state of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which labor is applied in any nation, the abundance or scantiness of its annual supply must depend, during the continuance of that state, upon the proportion between the number of those who are annually employed in useful labor and that of those who are not so employed. So this is where that proportion comes in. This is a lesser determination than the skill and employment of labor. So basically, the those who are employed in useful labor, if that proportion is higher, then the country as a in general is going to do better. The number of useful and productive laborers that will hereafter appear is everywhere in proportion to the quantity of capital stock which is employed in setting them to work, and to the particular way in which it is so employed. The second book, therefore, treats of the nature of capital stock, of the manner in which it is gradually accumulated, and of the different quantities of labor which it puts into motion according to the different ways in which it is employed. Nations tolerably well advanced as to skill, dexterity, and judgment in the application of labor have followed very different plans in the general conduct or direction of it, and those plans have not all been equally favorable to the greatness of its produce. The policy of some nations has given extraordinary encouragement to the industry of the country, that of others to the industry of towns. Scarce any nation has dealt equally and impartially with every sort of industry. Since the downfall of the Roman Empire, the policy of Europe has been more favorable to arts, manufactures, and commerce, the industry of towns, than to agriculture, the industry of the country. The circumstances which seem to have introduced and established this policy are explained in the third book. So this is basically like the whole split between rural and urban. He's saying that European countries are more favorable to urbanization and less favorable to agriculture. Though those different plans were perhaps first introduced by the private interests and prejudices of particular orders of men, without any regard to or foresight of their consequences upon the general welfare of the society, yet they have given occasion to very different theories of political economy, of which some magnify the importance of that industry which is carried on in towns, others of that which is carried on in the country. Those theories have had a considerable influence not only upon the opinions of men of learning, but upon the public conduct of princes and sovereign states. I have endeavored in the fourth book to explain as fully and distinctly as I can those different theories and the principal effects which they have produced in different ages and nations. To explain in what has consisted the revenue of the great body of the people, or what has been the nature of those funds, which in different ages and nations have supplied their annual consumption, is the object of these four first books. The fifth and last book treats of the revenue of the sovereign, or commonwealth. In this book, I have endeavored to show first what are the necessary expenses of the sovereign or commonwealth, which of those expenses ought to be defrayed by the general contribution of the whole society, and which of them that of some particular part only, or of some particular members of it. Secondly, what are the different methods in which the whole society may be made to contribute towards defraying the expenses incumbent on the whole society? And what are the principal advantages and inconveniences of each of these methods? And thirdly and lastly, what are the reasons and causes which have induced almost all modern governments to mortgage some part of this revenue or to contract debts? And what have been the effects of those debts upon the real wealth, the annual produce of the land and labor of the society? So basically, he spends the first four books of this book going into more theory, historical observations, breaking things down. The last one really is kind of that's the penultimate part of the book, where he's talking about how this actually looks, how the revenue of the sovereign or the Commonwealth, i.e., the national economy, the federal budget, called the federal budget. How do you tap into the GDP, essentially? What are the necessary expenses of the country? Which of them should be everybody contributes a bit to those expenses, and which expenses should only be paid for by some of it. Now, I kind of don't think that he's going to be talking a lot about the kinds of things that we talk about today, because there just weren't the options. A lot of the things that we deal with today, such as healthcare, were not actually topics of discussion back then, because most of the time is, oh, you try to stay away from doctors. That was there were physicians, but they weren't trained in the medical arts like modern doctors are. I'm not saying that there weren't some good doctors, but they were all dealing with they were within a framework that was not very good. But he's also talking about he's also going to be talking about in the last part about federal debt, essentially, and the effects of that debt has on everything. Anyway, that is I'm gonna end that there. That's the introduction, and gonna go into the next episode is gonna go into chapter one, talk about the division of labor. Um, That'd be chapter one of book one. Anyway, I don't know how this is gonna go. This is just something where I was like, I haven't done this before. I haven't actually read this book before. Everybody knew, everybody would talk about what the book has in it, but it was never something that was assigned to us in class. So I just never picked it up because there's always so many things. But I'm hoping that maybe this can help us get back to more discussing some of these things in a more reasonably, more balanced way by just kind of, hey, where was this supposed to go to? What were the because I suspect that what's going to happen here is that what this says looks a lot different than how we construct modern capitalism. That's my suspicion. Anyway, thanks for hanging. If you found this useful or you think it's going to be useful to other people, go ahead and give a like and subscribe. And I hope that you have a fantastic rest of your week, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much.